Go. Right.
So today's talk is about supporting children, our unique children with extra needs, and especially through this difficult time with coronavirus, COVID-19. And it really is one thing where adults are holding their own selves together, their own mental health, their families. It's challenging. And then if you have children on top, they're not able to do their usual things. That's an additional challenge. But when you're blessed with unique children who have, the support of whom is built around the external infrastructure, around the support from schools and therapists and routines and patterns, it can be especially difficult. And I think we often don't even notice these children around because the parents and schools and system are doing such a good job with them. But this is a real thing in our society, and we should all be aware, whether it's for our own children or whether it's for society at large, because they are part of our society. Okay, um, so so the first thing I want to touch on is COVID-19 and the mental health of children. So this is of children in general. So there was an article in the Guardian newspaper on the 21st of June that noted that COVID-19 affects black and minority ethnic youth mental health more than white peers in a study. So meaning that children from black and Asian backgrounds essentially are struggling much more from a mental health point of view than their white counterparts. And this may be because of the higher death rate from coronavirus, the inability to attend school, especially if you're living in a very small environment without school meals and various other things. So it seems to be having a much bigger impact on our children. There is an online counselling tool for young people up until the age of 25, which I understand covers 85% of England. And it's called Kooth. It's a free counselling service. And while these aren't absolute facts, what they've found is that there's been a 26% increase in calls around children feeling suicidal, young people feeling suicidal, compared with an 18% increase in white children. They feel this increase is significant, and they've looked at various other factors in terms of the number of calls that they're getting and the types of calls that they're getting. I don't have the absolute numbers, but what we can see is that the rate has gone up. How these mental health problems are presenting are with things such as difficulty sleeping, concerns about school and college and family relationships. Remember that for many first and second generation children, the only way out of poverty into a better life, if you've got refugee children that have come over, or asylum seeking families, or people that have left a war-torn country, or people that are trying to climb the social ladder, actually your only passport to a better life is often the best route seen is that of education. And so, many of us do not have inheritance, and estates and rich, families to inherit from. Some people go down the family business route, but education is something that's highly esteemed in our communities. And when that becomes disrupted, it causes a huge amount of internal turbulence and anxiety about the future. There was also a tweet that I looked at last night from the Childhood Trust, and this was reported on ITV, and it said that coronavirus is affecting children adversely and disproportionately. Many children are starting to have nightmares every day, and when this whole thing settles down, there will be a tsunami of need unless we deal with things in the right way now. And the other concern is that the poorest children are the worst affected. They've seen high death rates. So they're afraid to go out. They're not able to go to school, but they may not also have access to devices so that they can access remote learning. And I want to talk about the invisible wheelchair now. So the children who appear to be well. So we talked about well children struggling. I want to explain about the invisible wheelchair. So this is when we see somebody in a wheelchair, we try and make space for them. We create extra access for them. We slow down, we're patient, we can see the disability and we learn to work with them. We know they're having a hard time. But it's the children in the invisible wheelchair who we don't seem to recognise. And of course, they're going through COVID as well. So by the invisible wheelchair, I mean learning disabilities such as dyslexia, which is difficulty reading, ADHD, autism, which I haven't put on here, dyscalculia, difficulty with maths, difficulty writing, and sensory processing or processing problems. So these are things that we don't see but have a very real impact. So I'm going to talk about the impact of these conditions on the next slide. So this is not a problem with intelligence or motivation. It's not that these children don't want to do well, that they don't want to have a good life. It's just that the difference lies in how they receive, process, and retain information. So their brain works in a way that's not neurotypical, works in a very different way. Other, what I would call invisible wheelchair conditions, so special educational needs, would include things like anxiety, depression, OCD, and eating disorders, which we know are all very, very common and actually becoming much more common in our children and young people. And then, of course, we have the visible wheelchair where you have physical disabilities, but say, for example, somebody's blind, that might not be so obvious. So these are our extremely vulnerable young people. And I want to look at Muslim children and intellectual disabilities, so things like mental health conditions and learning difficulties. So estimates suggest that up to 7% of children with intellectual disabilities in the UK will be Muslim in 2021. So that's quite a large number compared with our overall, compared with the overall rate. So something like autism we think is approaching 0.5 to 1%. Of children. But if we're looking at 7%, that's quite a high number. And of course, it includes the other conditions as well. This seems to be above baseline. Children with intellectual disabilities face social isolation, lack of extended family support, problems accessing health, education, and employment. So these children have low self-esteem and they are not accepted or integrated into mainstream society, which is a very tough life to live, not just for themselves, but their families. Often there's a belief that these sorts of disabilities are caused by jinns and supernatural causes, which you know is not true. In fact, they're caused by a combination of genetic, birth, and environmental factors. So, say a birth injury, or you've got the genes, but it's not been diagnosed higher up in the family tree. But perhaps you've had some trauma or stress or something. We know children that face stress in their early years much more likely to have difficulties such as autism. And other neurobiological difficulties, and of course the environment in which we live, perhaps the food that we're eating, the lifestyles that we're living. There can be lots and lots of factors, but it's not caused by supernatural causes. So we've talked about some of the challenges for healthy children, but what are the additional challenges for children with special needs? So these children usually have a baseline higher level of anxiety, and this only goes up during this period. It's much harder for them. They're facing a loss of routine and structure, and that routine is very, very grounding for them. It tells them what's going to happen next, gives them a sense of certainty in the world. Some of them may be suffering with obsessions such as hand washing and fear around cleanliness and hygiene. They may be afraid of leaving the house. They are facing social isolation more so than your healthy fit children, because they may not have as a robust a circle of friendships. That's often difficult for children with additional needs. Some children, for example, children with autism, may face an obsession with facts or information. They may want to know everything that's going on and have a lot of questions and a lot of theories, and they may become quite fixated with some of this information. We also have their parents who are facing a loss of support, loss of infrastructure from services. Then some of these conditions are associated with increased, actually just addiction to screens. And we know that can always be linked with behaviour problems. There's a problem of boredom, restlessness, and the need to move. For example, with ADHD, it's very hard. So if you're living in a small space, managing that child is extremely difficult. And also then the baseline of a heightened fear at home. So I wanted to bring in just a couple of slides on the Islamic perspective on disability. So I understand the majority of people here are going to be from Bangladesh and Somali backgrounds. So I put in a couple of verses from the Quran talking about disability and how we view it from an Islamic perspective. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillah, ليس على الأعمى حرج ولا على الأعرج حرج ولا على المريض حرج ومن يطع الله ورسوله يدخله جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار ومن يتولى يعذبه عذابا أليما. So there is upon the blind, there's no guilt upon the blind or the lame or upon those who are chronically ill if they are not able to take part in the battles. And whoever obeys Allah and His Messenger, He will admit him to gardens beneath which rivers flow. And in a similar verse in Surah Nur, there's not upon the blind any constraint, or upon the lame any constraint, or upon those who are chronically ill, so for example have a mental health illness or a physical illness, when you eat from your own houses or the houses of various relatives. But when you enter the houses, give greetings of peace upon each other, greeting from Allah, blessed and good. So thus does Allah make clear to you the verses that you may understand. I think these are very important verses, because what they're saying is essentially that yes, there may be some dispensation for the people that are disabled, so we cannot have necessarily the same expectations from them, either from a spiritual or practical point of view, but they are not guilty for their condition. This is not as a result of some sin or crime or some evil spirit that they have ended up here. And actually, their rank before God and their ability and their status is the same as a well person who's not tested in the same way. And what we're seeing here is a concept of equity, in the sense that they're judged with a different bar, but they are still able to achieve the gardens of paradise. So the ultimate spiritual hope is still on an equal footing for them. And the other verse, verse 2461, what we're learning here is really in the sort of pre-Islamic Arab society, and we see in many cultures, defective children, female children were often killed or buried alive, or disregarded. But here, God is saying really that they are your family members. There's no blame upon them, and they are not restricted. So eat with them. Now, eating is a basic social habit. Really, it's one of the foundations of society, that we sit and eat together, and we shouldn't leave them out. They're on an equal footing. They're integral members of the family, and the family being the microcosm of the basic unit of society. So they are equal members of our society. And here again, what is the worth? So in our present society, we often don't feel that disabled people carry the same worth. What we often tend to find is that, unless you're economically productive, you're not treated the same way. So a stay-at-home mother, people that are on council benefits, people that have a disability, even despite all the rights, we know that their lives are not filled with the same kind of quality that we would like them to be. And it is a sad state, and we've just seen the whole Black Lives Matter protest, people of a different colour feeling treated unequally. But actually, let's look at what Islam says about the worth of these people. And again, I bring this in because of the audience that we have, and for people to be able to get a more balanced perspective. So we know in the Hadith, which is the tradition from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that it says, Allah looks neither at your appearances nor at your wealth, rather He looks at your hearts and your deeds. And you don't need to be physically or mentally, completely perfect for that. What you're finding is that He is looking at the quality of your heart, your spiritual heart, your character, your behaviour, your conduct, your wanting good for other people. And that is the great leveller in this. And we know that people that have disabilities in one area have strengths and skills in other areas. So somebody that's blind may have very focused hearing. They may be able to memorise things a lot more easily. People that are autistic, especially if they're Asperger's, they're sometimes very, very able in terms of the kinds of problems that they solve. And we've had many famous people who are actually high-functioning autistic. It doesn't mean that they don't have challenges in other parts of their lives, but they are gifted elsewhere. It's about channeling and bringing those gifts and seeing that we're all part of a whole human community. And then there was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and he said that a man came forward and he led us in prayer. That man was lame, as his leg had been hit in the cause of Allah, so he may have been maimed in the battle, but yet he was not seen as any lesser than them. For you to be able to lead the prayer, you have to be considered as somebody who has the best skills, for example, in reciting Quran. So he was allowed to have a leadership position and a position of respect and status, despite the fact that he was lame. And here, the next box, you see a woman who had a mental disability, and she came to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and said, "I have a need that I want you to meet." And he responded, "Choose how you would like me to walk with you, so that I may know your need and meet it." So she obviously had a particular need. He treated her with compassion. He met her need, and he walked with her until she had her need fulfilled. So he didn't despise her. He didn't look down on her. He didn't see that she was a waste of time or a waste of place in society. Rather, he met her with compassion and forbearance and chose to meet her need. And lastly, one of the famous caliphs after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passed away, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, he asked the governors to send him the names of all those who were blind, crippled, or with a chronic illness, including mental illness, that prevented them from praying. So their names are submitted, and he in turn ordered that every blind man should have somebody to guide him and look after him, and every two people with chronic illness or a special need should be attended by a servant to serve and care for them. So this was a basic infrastructure of the early Islamic State, was recognising and valuing people with disabilities who are not necessarily economically productive in life, and to be able to provide a welfare state for them because they were people of equal value. So, having spoken about sort of additional needs, I'm going to talk about the bread and butter of building up emotional resilience. And we've talked a lot about this over the last few weeks. But this will apply just as much to complete neurotypical and healthy children, to adults, as well as to children who have, special needs. So the first thing, I've got 10 points here, is a gratitude journal, and to write down between 3 and 10 things every day in this journal that you feel grateful for, and it doesn't matter how big or how small they are, and ideally to look for something different. Make sure there's a good dose of laughter in the house. Find something silly. It's not good to be serious all the time. It really isn't good for you. In fact, I was reading today that a proper smile engages 16 muscles of the face, and it produces the same amount of internal happiness as eating 2,000 bars of chocolate. So I think a little bit of laughter goes quite a long way. And tip number 3 is acts of random kindness. We spoke a bit about this last time. But, don't wait for people to ask you. Go and put that kettle on, make a nice cup of tea, or give a foot massage or a hug, or do a chore for somebody, something where you're not expecting anything in return. And you'll find that that really boosts your sense of well-being. Children can also write a letter to themselves. They can write a letter to themselves looking forward 30 years and giving them advice for this time now. And that's a really great way, because what they'll realise is to put things in perspective and to see that everything's actually going to be okay. But I think that's quite a fun one to do. Tip number 5 is encouraging a growth mindset. So I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but a growth mindset is really about thinking that things are not fixed. They're thinking, rather than that I'm bad at something, that I can become better at something. Having a mindset of hope, mindset of change. And I've given some resources at the end that can be used to develop this. And of course, you can Google, there are lots and lots of resources around the growth mindset. But especially when people are struggling, telling them, well, you can't do this right now, rather than putting them down, actually, we can't do this yet, but we're going to learn how to do it, and that will be okay. And if we make a few mistakes along the way, that's also fine. We've spoken a lot about exercise in the past, but getting out, getting any amount of exercise, getting sunshine, being in the greenery is really, really healthy. It helps the brain to switch off. It releases endorphins, which are happy hormones, and it helps to improve your health overall, to fight the inflammation around, and become more resilient physically as well against coronavirus. Um, Point number 7 is celebrating the strengths. So if your child does something well, rather than always nitpicking and saying, well, this isn't good, that isn't good, actually say, actually, you've done this really well. Find the things that they're good at, build them up. This is your golden opportunity. Point number 8 is spending some special time reading to them, even if they're able to read. Reading is a very, it's a very special activity, because it brings us physically close to one another. It wires our brains together. It gives us a close and shared emotional experience, and it's something that's actually very pleasurable and allows a child to feel that they're getting one-to-one time. And I particularly enjoy reading children's fiction. I think it takes me away from the adult world, and I really love it, actually. But I wouldn't pick it up on my own. I think sometimes I feel that, life is full of all this serious stuff and I've got great mountains to conquer. But actually sitting down with a children's book is really, really pleasurable. It takes you away to a fantasy world. And then social connection, greeting people. So last week, I think we did mention the hadith, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, came to Medina. He said, advise people to afsahu salam, to greet people, feed people, and pray at night, and keep your ties of kinship, and you will enter paradise without any difficulty. And actually, social connection is something that's a particular problem in London. We don't say hello to people, we don't know people. But this is a time to take the first step. If we're craving it, other people are. And our children should be trained in this, so we should teach them to say hello. Obviously, not to become overly friendly with strangers, but if you see people around, make them the first ones to say hello and greet people with a smile. And lastly, tip number 10 is a 7-second hug. So we find that the average hug is 2.1 seconds, and it's good, but it's not enough to release the oxytocin, the hormone of connection, love and security. So make it a nice deep hug and make it for 7 seconds. And I think we'd all love to just, bathe in those hugs and be embraced for a lot longer. Okay. The next slide I have is around additional consideration. So for our special children, we've got some extra special things to think about. Firstly, as I said, it's very, very important to talk to all children, to listen to them and give them emotional support at this time. But as we mentioned earlier, children with additional needs often have a heightened level of anxiety, so it's even more important that we are available for them. Point number 2, give them routine and familiarity. So as much as you're able to, create a family routine, create a timetable, make it visual if you can, put it up, so that children, it gives them a degree of certainty at this uncertain time. And put in some things that are familiar, for example, familiar foods or familiar activities, if that's watching a TV program that you do together, or, playing with their favourite toys. So make it a routine and make it familiar as much as possible to try and compensate. If they're able to go to school and you feel it's safe enough, then do consider that, because it gives them, again, a sense of routine and familiarity, even though school is not quite the same as before. Screen time is a particularly big problem at the moment. A lot of children are on devices all the time, and that can be quite challenging for the parents, and also it can affect the behaviour of the children. We need to recognise that these are extraordinary times, so being a bit more lax with the screen is probably okay, so long as you have things like parental control in place and some clear boundaries, for example, no screen time an hour before bed, and perhaps deciding when you have your screen time, so you make it clear. It might be more than usual, but it's important to still have boundaries. And make sure all the basic things are still happening, so that getting a proper, good quality sleep with enough hours, they're getting some exercise, nutritious meals, all those things should still be happening to maintain their physical and mental well-being. I think it's especially important for children with additional needs to have contact with their friends, because their friendship circle may be less secure, and they may be very anxious about this. Especially children with autism can worry about forming and holding out friendships because their social skills are compromised. So make a special effort to get them either on Zoom or Google Meets or Hangouts, and take the initiative if you have to on behalf of your child. And then when you feel ready, you could go out for a socially distanced meetup, such as a game of tennis outside, which is allowable. It's also important to limit the exposure to COVID-related news. So one way to do this is to make sure you only check the news or put it on or check the news feed once or twice a day, but not more than that. Some children, especially with autism or OCD, can become really obsessive about this. They may want all the information. They may start asking very, very complex questions and find it hard to switch off, and their whole life might become a fascination for them. So it's important to limit their exposure and to talk to your child and address their concerns. But also sometimes you might find that the conversations get very circular or impossible to solve, and it's important just to take a step back and set some reasonable boundaries on these discussions to avoid getting embroiled. And lastly, to manage the anxiety and the obsessions, again, you could use some breathing, mindfulness and meditation techniques. Okay. The other thing that a lot of children from minority backgrounds are dealing with are loss and isolation. How do we deal with this? Well, as I said, it's especially important for our communities to maintain contact with family and friends, and to let people know they can talk whenever they want via video calls or online, and now with socially distanced meetups within the advice given by the government, although I do feel that as a community we should be a little bit more careful. Um, we need to give our children opportunities to talk about how they're feeling, but also giving them space to grieve in ways that work for them. Teenagers especially might need some private space in the house during lockdown. So you could do this by creating a rota to share rooms, so that that child has some extra time to have some space to themselves. And then you could think with them about things that might help them communicate or express how they're feeling. So I've kind of chopped off the bottom of the slide, but it is there when you get the presentation. So lots of suggestions here. For example, they could write a letter to the person they've lost and say all the things they want to. They could write to someone who's supporting them to know tell them what you're going through on a day-to-day basis. Keep a journal or a diary of how they feel, making a painting or pictures, writing songs or poems, and creating a memory box full of items and pictures. These can all be ways for them to identify with their feelings. And then, look at what their internal resources are. What are the activities that help them cope with difficult situations in normal life, and which of these can they still do and access during lockdown? So, this could be, for example, running, drawing, listening to music, talking to friends, watching a favourite film, cooking or baking or reading a book. So what are their coping strategies? Is it a cuddly toy? Is it listening to music? Is it praying? What is it? Find it and help them to connect with that particular activity to help them soothe themselves. And encourage them to keep doing these activities if they want to. You can reassure them that it's okay to have a good time even though they're going through something so difficult, and that this does not take away from how much they care about the person who's died. If you go onto the Young Minds website, you'll find a whole load of other resources that are really, really helpful for young people. But I pulled this information from there because I felt it would be useful. Oopsie daisy. And then a little bit about parental self-care. So this is really important. When managing children with extra needs, we need to also take care of ourselves. And there are 3 elements to self-care. There's caring for your body, caring for your mind, and caring for your soul. And there are lots and lots of tips on how to manage each of these. But I think that it's all the stuff that we've talked about for children on the previous slides. The rest, the exercise, the sleep, the downtime, the journaling, that applies equally to adults.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure we're doing all of that. And you're absolutely right. And we talked previously about becoming the manager of the household and building your family up as a team. I think we've said this on every single call. And that's really, really important. And it's a hard shift to make, but it comes back to learning some managerial skills and operating a family as a system, but also taking that time out for yourself and learning to express how you're feeling, that you are feeling tired, that you are feeling exhausted, that you are going to need some additional support. And maybe making yourself a nice cup of tea, or, putting on some makeup, or, not having pajama days as we discussed before. It's all those things. Having time to connect with God. So I've put down here from buried in the remembrance of Allah, do hearts find rest. So that's spiritual connection, looking after your body, looking after your mind. Okay.
Definitely.
And towards the end of the presentation, I've got down here, we've got some useful resources that I thought some of these are generic and some of them are Muslim specific. It's quite hard within the Muslim community to, one, understand what special needs are, and two, to get culturally sensitive resources. So the first time I put down, the first 2 are actually American resources, because I didn't have anything similar in the UK, but they're very, very good, and the resources are online. So it's muslim.org, Muslims Understanding and Helping Special Educational Needs, and it's there's a wealth of resources on there about understanding disability, what it means, and how to support your family. And the second one is Enabled Muslim. Again, it's very useful. And then generic ones, UK based, you could contact acams.org, They've got a number of wonderful podcasts on managing autism, ADHD, eating disorders, depression, anxiety. I mean, it's a very, very useful website. Autistica.org, specifically for Autism College, that's an American site. Youngminds.org.uk, so children that are generally struggling with mental health. They can access a lot of useful advice, and there's useful advice on there for parents as well. And there's some books for the Muslim audience. You've got the Young Muslims Mindful Book of Wellbeing by Zaid and Mia. I would say that's probably for children aged 9 and under. For children struggling with a bit more anxiety, My Hidden Chimp is a workbook Professor Steve Peters, and it's really good. It's about productivity, it's about managing anxiety, and it's about how this chimp is kind of basically controlling your mind and telling you to do all the wrong things so you can discipline your chimp. And then we talked a bit about growth mindset. So if you go on the biglifejournal.com website, they do have a journal. It's a bit expensive, but they also have lots of free printables, tell you how to reframe your thinking. And often as parents, if we've not been trained in the growth mindset, it's difficult for us to give that to our children, but that is what they need right now. They need to know the world is going to be okay, their lives are going to be fine. Whether they're neurotypical or not neurotypical, it's going to be okay. The brain can be stretched, it can be grown, and we have to work to our strengths. And lastly, if you need help, where do you go? So if your child, and of course for yourself as well, but because today's talk is about children, feeling low or anxious most of the time, they're unable to function, unable to get out of bed, they're not eating, they can't enjoy anything, they're having angry tantrums, they're moody, you probably need some help. Of course, if they're experiencing suicidal thoughts or thoughts of self-harm, these are an emergency, and you would call 999 or call the CAMS crisis team. Otherwise, you can access help through your GP, through the CAMS service, where your GP would have to refer you. Kooth is an online counselling service for young people, where they can talk through their worries and their fears, and it's free and readily available. And then, as I said, if there's an emergency, it would be the crisis team, 999, or attending A&E.